Hello, everyone. We would like to welcome you to our third and final presentation on advocacy basics given by local experts in advocacy. The Nebraska Regional Council of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the Nebraska chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics came together and received a grant through the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry to collaborate and improve our advocacy knowledge and efforts. And these advocacy training videos are part of this grant effort. We will also have a meet and greet with senators coming up in November and training on the national level from folks from the American Academy of Pediatrics in December. And today we have Dr. Beth Ann Brooks presenting on writing letters and testifying. So welcome everyone.
Thank you, Joan. As you said, ROCAP and Nebraska AAP began this 3-session webinar series on August 7, when Liz Lyons of Children's Hospital and Senator John Arch began by giving their perspectives about how the Nebraska unicameral functions. Then Dr. Carla Lester eloquently described how to reach out to legislators and prepare for your contacts with them in her September 17th advocacy presentation. Today, I will be presenting the nuts and bolts of the legislative process, letter writing, and testimony. I have no conflicts to declare other than I am a member of ROCAP and have functioned as its legislative chair, as well as serving in the same role for the Nebraska Psychiatric Society. So I will begin my presentation at this point, I hope. Well, I see it, and now I don't know what to do, Laura.
Just hit share screen
Share.
and select your presentation.
Share, exactly. Here we go. So
there you go.
There may be a bit of overlap, but just as a reminder, the legislative session moves very quickly, and January is the time to watch for bills of interest to you. The makeup of committees changes every 2 years. In odd-numbered years, they are the long legislative sessions, which more or less go from January through May. And in even-numbered years, they are short sessions in normal times, perhaps January through March. This year was very different because of COVID. The session was interrupted and finally concluded in August. So January of 2021 will begin the 2-year biennium, and because it is an odd-numbered year, that will be the long legislative session. Bill hearings usually get scheduled 7 days prior to the actual hearing date. So it's important to watch closely for a bill you are interested in as to its committee assignment and the actual hearing date. Oftentimes the assignment will be made the same day the bill is introduced. The hearing date can be variable as to when it's announced. The Speaker of the legislature this past year was Jim Scheer from Norfolk, actually the past 2 years for the biennium. That person orders the agenda for floor debate on the bills. That's when after a bill comes out of committee. So important bills generally are debated earlier. That is not a hard and fast rule. And bills that advance earlier out of committee tend to be scheduled earlier for debate. So timing becomes very important. And so every step in the legislative process, as Dr. Lester said, is an opportunity to advocate. Now, this is a busy slide, but it basically takes you through what happens at the committee level and then the full legislature beginning with general file. Bill introduction occurs from the very first day of the legislative session, and that is always the first Wednesday after the first Monday in January. And bill introduction continues for the first 10 legislative days. So would there be a holiday, as there usually is with Martin Luther King Day, that would not count because it's 10 business days as a matter of custom. Then committee assignments and chairs of the committees are elected the first day of the legislative session. Sometimes it's kind of contentious. Most of the time it is not an open vote, but committee chairs are elected, and as those bills are introduced, they get referred to a committee and then scheduled for a hearing. Every committee operates a little differently, and every committee has an assigned clerk, more or less similar to a legislative aide, and you can contact them if you have questions. Every committee has its own web page, if you will. So after a bill's hearing, that committee where the bill was assigned goes into closed or executive session. They discuss the bill and they vote on the bill. And if a committee votes to, quote, advance the bill, then there is a committee statement created and the bill would advance to the floor of the legislature for debate by the entire legislature, and that would be general file. So there are 3 rounds of debate and votes on the legislative floor. Amendments may be offered by any senator or even the sponsoring senator of the bill. And then they can be voted on as amendments to the bill being heard either during general file or select file, but not during final reading. And sometimes then bills will get held up because there are multiple amendments, and the bill has to be heard following the amendments being voted on. And so this is oftentimes the way that bills will get waylaid. If the governor vetoes a bill, which would be the final, after the final reading, a bill goes to the governor. If he or she vetoes it, then any override by the legislature requires 30 votes to override. This year, it was either 5 or 6 bills that went to the governor's office, and he has 5 days to act on them. And there were not sufficient days of the legislative session remaining to even attempt to act on the governor's veto. So that's the overall process, most of which we've heard about before. Also, Carla mentioned, or I'm sorry, it was Liz Lyons who mentioned the standing committees. The 14 of them are indicated here. And I put stars by those that would most often apply to us as child advocates. And many of our bills would be heard in the Health and Human Services Committee. However, if you think of the motorcycle helmet repeal bill that was heard under transportation. And so it's interesting. I think the tanning booth bill was heard under business and labor. But most of the time, bills of our interest would be Health and Human Services, probably followed by Education and Judiciary. But it's all up to where they get assigned. So how to have an impact, as Carla told us, there are different ways to have a voice. You can send a letter or an email anytime after a bill is introduced. It has to arrive by 5 p.m. on the day before the committee hearing to ensure that any legislator would have read your email or letter. And most commonly, I know Senator Sarah Howard did it this year as chair of Health and Human Services Committee. Without fail, she acknowledges every letter or email that was received, either supporting or opposing a bill. And so that type of advocacy does have an impact. You can testify at a bills committee hearing because Nebraska is unique among legislatures across the country because every bill receives a public hearing. So you also then can email letters by 5 p.m., not twice, just 5 p.m. on the day before a scheduled floor debate. And you may choose whether you think it's important to email the sponsor of the bill, your own legislator, or key legislators who have sponsored amendments or through informal mechanisms you've learned are highly supportive of the bill or are going to speak against it in the debate. And as Carla clearly reminded us, you can request a personal meeting at any time with your senator or his or her staff. And many times it's the legislative aide who is more readily available than the senator. So letter writing, there is a typical format. We refer to our legislators in print as the Honorable, and then Sarah Howard as an example. Some letters are addressed Senator Sarah Howard, and that's fine, but the typical address is the Honorable and then the senator's first and last name. You will be most efficient if you address it to the chair of whatever committee is hearing the bill, and then standard Nebraska legislature, state capitol, the room number if you have it for the senator's office, and then Lincoln 68509. It does seem to be that fewer and fewer hard copy letters are received either by fax or US mail, and that email seems to be the major convention of receiving correspondence. And then if you have addressed it to the chair of the committee, you can simply make your letter read, "Dear, for example, Education Committee members." And that may make it a little easier while you would still have to send it to individual legislators. You could carbon copy them on your emails. So that's, in terms of my experience, the standard format for letter writing. Then some general tips about letters. You definitely need to ask at the beginning of the letter for your letter to be included as part of the public hearing record supporting or opposing LB, which stands for legislative bill, and then the bill's number. You run the risk, if you do not put that statement in, that the letter will be disregarded. You need to include your name, address, and your educational credentials. And please remember not to use an organization's stationery unless you are the sole owner of that or you have permission from the agency or the institution. And this is easily forgotten about in haste if there is a last minute advocacy request for letter writing, but it is important. Actually, I was in a testimony last year, and one of the proponents of a bill that the child advocates were all opposing was asked specifically by a member of the committee if that proponent's organization held that same position because it was written on corporate letterhead. And unfortunately, that proponent testifying was forced into a position to say no. He had only been in Nebraska 6 months and didn't know that that was the convention. So it appeared that he was testifying as a private individual not related to his organization. And then, as we've said before, after you've written your letter, email one copy to the committee chair before 5 p.m. on the business day. So if there's a hearing on Monday afternoon, the business day close is Friday. And also watch, because during, after all the bills have been introduced, there are legislature recess days, and you have to be aware of that to hit the 5 p.m. on the business day before. And it's up to you whether or not you want to send your letter to each committee member. The more controversial or contentious the bill's matter is, I would recommend definitely then emailing your letter to everyone on the committee. But for example, if I'm going to be testifying, I traditionally don't do that. And if it is a general letter of support or opposition that we know a lot of colleagues are similarly sending letters, then I oftentimes don't email a copy of the letter to each committee member. Letters should be brief. I try very hard to have at least an 11 point font size and try to fit it on one page. You aren't always able to do that, but brief letters have greater likelihood of being read and attention paid to them. You definitely want to avoid technical or medical terms, and it's most useful if you can briefly highlight one or two issues that have prompted you to either support or oppose the bill. And as Carla told us, using your own experiences to illustrate why you have taken that position will carry greater weight. So those are general tips for letter writing. I recall the first time that I needed to testify at something related to the legislative process, and it was actually a 407 committee, which is a process when a profession wants to change their scope of practice, and it usually involves expanding their scope of practice. And I had no idea how the process worked in Nebraska. But luckily, searching things on the legislature's website and with useful tips from a helpful lobbyist, I was able to feel comfortable testifying there. That same issue, I had to testify as the only opponent of the bill in front of the Board of Health. And they had different rules and regulations, if you will. But I think that experience prepared me well for testifying at bill hearings. And I'm usually at the Capitol testifying on a few bills every year. So committees tend to consider more than one bill in an afternoon. Committee hearings usually begin at 1:30, and the committee chair that day determines the order in which bills are heard. And the reason for that is a sponsoring legislator for that bill may have committee business elsewhere, or one of the committee members may be sponsoring a bill within a different committee. So it does become a logistics problem, and the committee chair has the prerogative to order the bills, and you usually don't know about it till noon that day. The chair also determines rules for testifying and whether there will be time limits. So the hearing length of any individual bill varies, and it depends largely on the number of testifiers. I have probably 1/3 of the time not had time limits on bills that I have been testifying at, but more often than not, the committee chair invokes time limits. As you enter the hearing room, look for a registration table. There are various colored sheets on the table, and there is a testifier sheet that you have to complete, and you also have to sign in that you are there at the hearing, and then you indicate whether you are testifying or not, whether you're a proponent or an opponent. And then if you are testifying, that colored testifier sheet you retain with you when you're seated in the hearing room, and you hand it to the legislative page or hearing assistant when you go up to testify. Just some housekeeping things: beverages, snacks aren't allowed. You will see senators being given them or asking for them from pages. Your electronics need to be silenced. Don't talk aloud. Most of the time you can access Wi-Fi in hearing rooms. The most common issue I hear is that certain Wi-Fi sponsors recognize that it is a state capital and then won't broadcast. So you generally are able to use your electronics. You don't address committee members, or you don't make any comments from the audience. We don't allow public demonstrations nor applause. So those are some of the general caveats. What happens first? The sponsoring senator comes forth. He or she introduces the bill with some background of why the bill came to be, and the committee chair directs proponents to move forward and testify individually. And then opponents are asked to testify, and that's a little awkward. Opponents always come first, but you're sitting in the audience and you've generally been in the back because the committee members are seated in the front in kind of a semicircle. And so people stand up, sort of look at each other and move to the front row, and then in no particular order, someone starts with the opposition testimony. And the committee chair is not calling people up. So it's a bit of a free-for-all. Sometimes if you know colleagues or other organizations that have the same position as you, you can talk among yourselves before the hearing begins. Sometimes there is neutral testimony provided from an organization or more often a state of Nebraska entity. I'm sorry, I totally misspoke because I wasn't reading this correctly. Proponents testify first, followed by opponents, and then neutral testimony. And if the introducing senator is still available, and most often they are, then that senator provides closing comments. And sometimes they are clever with their closing comments and include rebuttal to testimony of either, well, usually it's of opponents. If you have handouts that illustrate your testimony, or you want to give the committee members copies of your testimony, bring a dozen copies and give those handouts to the page. At the same time, you give the page your testifier sheet, and the page will then distribute them to the senators. And there is oftentimes one or two committee staff who are present. And it's quite common that the committee has a legislative aide or attorney that helps with their staffing. So you begin your testimony by stating your name and title. And then because this is a public hearing and there is a verbatim transcription, they ask you to spell out your name. And if you forget to spell out B-E-T-H space capital A-N-N space B-R-O-O-K-S, you will be reminded. And it's a little embarrassing when that happens. Usually, as I indicated, there is a time limit on testimony. It's usually 3 minutes. And they have a very friendly system on the witness table, easily in front of you. A green light comes on as you begin speaking. When there's 1 minute left, it turns yellow. And when you're out of time, it is red. You need to end your testimony when you see the red light, but a majority of time, the committee chair will allow you to complete your thought. But in contrast to political debates we see recently on television, you shouldn't go on and on, because it won't be tolerated, and the senators will remember that, particularly the committee chair. Try to put your testimony, just like your letters, in layman's terms, or if there is a complex medical term that you feel you need to use, then briefly explain it as you are trying to illustrate your position. It's not uncommon that after proponent testimony or someone testifying in opposition, that the committee members will ask questions about your testimony when you are still at the witness table. They may ask about your experiences or something combining the two of them. Do your best to answer questions. Don't make something up if you don't know the answer to the question. And if you don't know, you can say that you will follow up with the committee members when you have the answer. And that day or that weekend, you should remember to do so. And I, at that point, would direct any clarification or answer to a question to all of the committee members. Or if you know from advance from who else is testifying in the same direction as you, you might be able to indicate that someone coming behind you may be better suited to answer the question. But you also could be putting that colleague on the spot. Be prepared for senators to come and go. They have other commitments. They may be presenting other bills that meet at the same time. So sometimes I advise individuals, if they are going to be testifying at a very important bill, that if they are in the Lincoln area, they take time to just simply sit in on another bill's hearing so they have an idea of how things proceed. If you're not sure how to proceed, here is the website for the Nebraska Legislature, www.nebraskalegislature.gov. And that has biographies of senators. It has the bills they have sponsored. You can track bills. You can see all the bills that have been introduced to date. And as was indicated in an earlier session, the first bill to be introduced at the beginning of a legislative session is always LB1 for that session, and they go sequentially. And when the long legislative session ends, then when the short session resumes in January of the even numbered year, they begin numbering bills with the number following the last bill that was introduced. No bill is, how can I say this? All bills remain active from the long session into the following year's short session unless they have been totally killed by an individual committee. And that's not commonly done. And this year, even when the legislature resumed in late July, there were 2 bills from the prior year's long session that were heard and debated on the floor. And I am very available to you to answer any questions, provide other tips. I can help walk you through these steps, and I can also send you samples of letters and written testimony, and the slide has an example of that, as well as how to contact me. And I think this slide was omitted in the beginning. Senators introduce bills that they have developed to propose legislative remedies to issues they want to address. And you need to remember that sometimes those issues come from individual senators, but oftentimes they come from their constituents. And sometimes constituents and advocacy groups repeatedly, year after year, will approach senators to sponsor a bill. Sometimes bills don't get out of committee or don't ever go to the governor's desk for approval, but the same language is introduced year after year. And we've had very similar issue bills that the language doesn't change a lot, with efforts to repeal Nebraska's motorcycle helmet law, also to alter the age of consent for minors to use tanning booths. So senators have various pressures on them and introduce bills accordingly. There are a large number of bills that are written by various state entities or other constituent groups that then, when they're written by state entities, it's almost a surety that they will find one or more senators as co-sponsors to introduce the bill. In the Nebraska unicameral, as I said earlier, we have the advantage that each bill receives a public hearing. And you, as a private individual, member of the public, or representing special interest groups like Nebraska AAP, ROCAP, other groups, hospitals, etc., are allowed to testify as proponents, opponents, or provide neutral testimony. So that's my presentation that I was asked to keep to 30 minutes, and we'll entertain any questions.
Dr. Brooks, if you're interested in testifying, do you have to contact the legislature beforehand to sign up that you're going to testify or notify them, or do you just show up the day of the testimony?
You simply show up that day. However, oftentimes you will have emailed or written a letter in advance, but you can show up off the street. And just because the hearing afternoon begins at 1:30, there may be a bill that at noon that day it's revealed is going to be heard at 3:30. You can show up at that time. I think Dr. Doughton had an experience where she was testifying a couple of years ago on a bill, and didn't the hearing go until 8-10 p.m. at night?
Yes.
That's the exception, but that does show you how controversial or interesting a bill may be.
As a physician, sometimes I do get stuck if I'm thinking about writing a letter or even testifying between giving a lot of data or kind of background knowledge to senators versus talking about experiences of patients or myself, you know, in regards to whatever bill I'm addressing. And I know a little bit of both is good, but how do you decide kind of to balance that?
Well, I think maybe let's just talk about maybe the motorcycle helmet repeal. Data might be more useful there because we, in our pediatric and child psychiatry roles, well, we will, I take that back. We will see certainly traumatic brain injuries, but oftentimes that would be the kind of bill that there are statistics shown in terms of morbidity and mortality. There are other issues. I'm reminded of one that there were actually 3 bills. 2 of them were introduced in the long session 2 years ago, and then only 1 bill introduced in the short session this year, and that's the one that went to the floor about changing the Medicaid formulary for psychotropic and neurological medications. And the most compelling testimony was not from those of us in the behavioral health realm, but from family members of individuals who weren't allowed to be continuing on those medications. So I think it depends with subject matter. And I would say if you have a lot of data to present in testimony, please bring a handout and refer to that with maybe 1 or 2 key points like topic sentences. And in your testimony say, if you will refer to my handout, etc.
Thank you.
And I have a couple questions, Dr. Brooks. Thanks for all your slides. I was taking so many notes. I was like, I'm glad I have access to these slides, so it's awesome. How do you decide if you're going to testify versus writing a letter of support or sending an email? I struggle with that. And then I know you said we can show up, but how do you, I've shown up before and I thought, wow, this would have been way more effective had I actually reached out to the sponsoring senator. And he looked at me like, I sure would have appreciated that, you know, because I supported his bill.
Well, a lot depends on time because it's fast and furious. And this year there was an important bill to the psychiatric community that was actually heard in January. And it was difficult because we were opposing it. So you are right. When you are supportive of a bill, I would actually suggest calling the legislative aid for the senator and saying you're very interested in supporting this bill and how can you be of most help? Because when they introduce a bill, they seem to have some feel how contentious it's going to be. And remember, they've already heard from someone who wants them to sponsor it. And maybe with prior bills in earlier years on the same subject, they have an idea who might oppose it. So I would say contact the legislative aid and let them know, and then volunteer to be a testifier. Now, scope of practice bills, we've had many recently, optometrists versus ophthalmology, some years ago, nurse practitioners expanding their scope. You're going to be among a cavalcade of people waiting in the wings. So it's a little bit of a call. I would say talk with the executive of your organization who has some idea about that. Talk to your institution's vice president of government affairs, and they have contacts that we don't as individuals. And that will give you also some idea. But I don't think I have ever been at a bill hearing with fewer than 4 testifiers, and those have been more slam dunk bills. And for example, they've usually been at least 3 proponents and maybe 1 opponent. But I have been at bill hearings when there were only supporters there. And I've forgotten if that answered your questions, Carla did. Well, off to lunch, would you say?
I think that's all. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. I used to do a lot of teaching when I was in Detroit, but not much these days. So thank you.